Hi, and welcome to Leaving Babylon. I'm Madeline. It's great you can join me today to listen to further investigation of the Hidden Pacific. Today will be part 2 of this series, and it's called East is East. I try to just get to the point in my video, so the only thing I want to say first is this video is building further on many previous videos that I released. And I've been showing research spanning the lands of the Bible from a scriptural perspective and evidence-based as well. So there are many people who are becoming aware of the many modern narrative discrepancies. And, it's kind of, I would say, a growing body of work that myself and others are doing to really show that the modern narratives are not in agreement with what I would say the lands of the Bible are portrayed as in Scripture. And I think the modern locations of what, I would say most people think now to be the Bible lands are most likely a decoy. And so to understand the lead up to this, and before making comments, please note, I've done a lot of research. I've been researching this for a couple of years now, and I have actually shown receipts. So if you haven't seen my other videos, I really encourage you. It's a very natural instinct to knee-jerk a reaction to what, like new information, especially something that maybe is rooted in your beliefs. And so I can appreciate that. But I would just encourage you to pause, take a breath, and I've done a lot of videos on this. So what you might hear today, if this is your first time, could be a little bit shocking. I'm really researching and I'm as shocked as you are. But what I am finding is that there's evidence to show. I think there's some good hypotheses actually emerging here, some good speculation. And, we're just building on evidence, really. That would be both biblical and historical and other kind of material evidence that I've been bringing forward. So all I'm saying is get ready for this. It seems like every time I research now, because I'm building on other previously kind of hidden information, the new information that's coming to light every time is, very surprising to me. And again, I don't claim to know everything. I don't claim that everything I say is 100% true, because really when you're sifting through lies and you're sifting through deceptions, you are pulling out pieces and you're trying to fit things together. So I would just say go back to the videos. So the river is a video, the Sides of the North series, the coastal cataclysms, and I would even say the surrounding of the camp series, because there's quite a lot in there that is actually geographical, and I talk a lot about Asia in most of my videos. So and then more recently was revealed the land of Jesus, and in that video we found that there is a land in the Pacific Ocean on maps, and there's also unaccounted missing time in that North Pacific region. So when we add up the time across that region, it doesn't really add up all the way. So go ahead and check that one out as well. So the name of that land is actually Terra di Esso on the maps, and it translates in English to the land of Jesus. So to start, I want to just start talking about the Millennial Reign, and then I'm going to just lead you through some of the things that I found. So the first thing I want to ask is, did you know that during the Millennial Reign, war had ceased? And it is recorded that Jesus brought peace to the earth after the destruction of the old temple system, and Satan had been bound and thrown into the abyss, as we read in Revelation 20, and the enemies of the kingdom of Jesus were overthrown. And throughout the various series I've done, you could refer to the Loosing of Satan series, for example, where I discussed the various factors that we can look at historically to see that the loosing of Satan was indicated by a return of a few things that hadn't been there through that 1,000 years. Now, most of the world knows that 1,000 years as the Middle Ages. And if you just go look at any source, you'll see that the church was reigning for 1,000 years. And all over cathedrals and such, you will see that Jesus and the saints were also reigning. And, much of that evidence has disappeared because now the cathedrals are being turned into other things. There's been, Henry VIII alone did a great campaign to destroy many of the old monasteries and cathedrals. And so just throughout history, a lot of that actually was destroyed. But there is even evidence, remaining there. The whole earth has been filled with the information, with the evidence of this. But one thing I want to say, just focusing on the peace aspect. So I would say that, as I mentioned in my Loosing of Satan series, and I actually discussed with Jana, my friend from the puzzle picture, in a little bit more detail. We did a couple of podcasts called The Little Season Fictionary. And what we revealed, and I think what's being revealed, is that the rebels during the Millennial Reign, because there was still a time where, Satan was bound, but people had free will. It was the time of reigning, and Isaiah talks about the reign of Jesus as ruling with a rod of iron. So there was, I guess, a peace that was brought by the subduing of enemies. And we can also look at history and see that there were exiles, there were banishments, there were imprisonments during the Millennial Reign, or Middle Ages if you prefer. So these are some of the evidences that we just know anecdotally and even just documented through history. I want to read this verse here from John 16:33. And Jesus said, "These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." And as we know, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. So when the Millennial Reign was taking place, there was a time of peace, and that is documented throughout prophecy as well. But I wanted to say that I would, on the loosing of Satan, it seems to me that in my studies, I would call it an emancipation. Let's say Satan was loosed, and so were his rebel hosts. And I'm talking people. Okay, so during the Millennial Reign, if you didn't go along with the rules of the church who were governing under Christ, you would have been banished, you would have been, exiled and imprisoned, depending on what you've done. Now, the emancipation of these rebels is what I believe to be the time marker in the gears of the loosing of Satan machine, or one of the keys perhaps. And we don't really know how that happened. I'm just sort of speculating here, but in general, Satan was loosed, and we see some indications of that. And, for what I've, we have a character, whether real or fake, named Napoleon. Jana has done a recent study on her channel, The Puzzle Picture, and she recently covered Napoleon a little bit more depth. I've covered it in the Loosing of Satan series as well. Now, a friend of mine on Instagram, his channel is called Light of His Kingdom. His name is Aaron. He also shared a reel showing that Napoleon's statue in Paris shows that the name is written as Ni Apollyon, meaning of Apollyon. And so we have a direct correlation to the emancipation of rebels. And in my view, these are who now rule over this little time, this little season, as the Liberty Cult. That's what I've been calling them quite a lot, as my friend Ricardo mentioned. So they were liberated from the rules of Jesus by their own declaration. So I've painstakingly shown this through videos, and I think what's happened is these are the people that are taking it upon themselves by the power of Satan to so-called liberate the world. And what that really means is imposing this do as thou wilt liberty, which really is satanic. We know that famously Aleister Crowley is known for that particular saying. And I would say Gog and Magog have deceived the nations by way of this so-called independence through revolution and liberty. Now, these are very deceptive words, and the narrative is utterly and completely in service to an antichrist agenda. And Lucifer stated himself that he would ascend the Mount of Congregation and be as God. You know, this has always been his view of himself and the liberty that he wants, he thinks that he's giving to mankind. So the Antichrist movement has infected all aspects of the earth and the people on the earth. People genuinely buy into the concept of do as thou wilt. This is widespread and has been promoted through all of the international organizations like the United Nations and all of their affiliated organizations. So yeah, I mean, it really is covering all four quarters of the earth, it seems like to me. And it is an infection. It is turning away from the laws of God. It is a turning from that love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, with all your strength. These things that we would be doing under the rule of Christ if Satan was not roaming the earth and deceiving the nations. So I would say that these people, I would define them as the ultimate rebels. They've been there from the beginning, from Babel, and they were originally, I guess, like a rebel class that emerged after the flood, actually, through the Nimrod agenda. And the secret societies that I think are identified as Gog and Magog, in my mind, I've speculated that they are actually Gog and Magog. They're on the payroll, and that's in exchange for fortune and power and fame and influence and all of these things that these people have really bought into, and they have been bought as well. And these are who are at the helm of the rebellion. And so I'd like to make you aware of some speculations today, and you can decide whether you agree or not. I'm just providing evidence that has emerged from some deep research and prayer, and I hope to make a coherent case that will allow you to consider the possibilities of what I'm saying. And again, I don't sit here thinking that everyone will just naturally agree with me. This whole topic is so far away from anything anyone else is talking about. I feel quite adventurous and open to what I'm finding, and pray that I am led by the Holy Spirit through this all. I don't decide before I start, but I do uncover and piece together themes and evidence as I go. So I want to just highlight something, since we're coming off the back of the Land of Jesus video. I wanted to show you something I had found recently. As I was looking over some geography, because that's kind of my forte, I guess, I had always been very curious about this island of California. And what you'll find when you're searching the Terra di Esso, or the Land of Jesus, on maps is you'll often see California depicted as a very large island off the west coast, obviously. And what I found equally interesting as I read down under the history section on the Island of California Wikipedia page is that this section here, underlined in orange. Know that on the right hand of the Indies, there is an island called California, very close to the side of terrestrial paradise. And I've just circled it there. And then it says, and is peopled by Black women, which I have heard that California was like that. So, or that island in particular back then. There's a lot of historical evidence to say that. But the curious part in this particular study is that it says right here on Wikipedia that it's very close to the side of terrestrial paradise. So that's just something to bring forward. Now, during the Millennial Reign, so terrestrial paradise obviously being a place of peace, it's a place of perfection. And that is also the area that we see the land of Jesus being in. So something I want to show you, and I've been really impacted by this text. It's by Saint Athanasius, and it's called On the Incarnation. And I'm going to read what this person wrote. And it was written a long time ago, so you'll have to bear with the language, but I promise you this is so beautiful, and it speaks to the abolition of idolatry and war. And these two things in the time of the pagans went hand in hand. And one of the arguments I make in my video, The Millennial Reign, the Binding of Satan video, is that the indicators that Satan was bound and that the initiation of Jesus' kingdom was brought in was the abolition of paganism and idolatry. Okay, so the pagan practices ceased, and that is one of the biggest, most important things you can know about the Millennial Reign, because it's clear evidence, even in secular history, that that took place. But I want to read this just to give you an idea of what the writers of a long time ago, and I can't tell you when Athanasius lived, but I will read what he wrote. Who is there then that was reigning and despoiling his enemies almost before he was born? Let the Jews who have investigated the matter tell us if there was ever such a king in Israel or Judah, a king upon whom all the nations set their hopes and had peace, instead of being at enmity with him on every side. As long as Jerusalem stood, there was constant war between them, and they all fought against Israel. Now, I want to just add a side note here. He's talking about Jerusalem standing in the past tense. Next sentence. The Assyrians oppressed Israel, the Egyptians persecuted them, the Babylonians fell upon them, and strange to relate, even the Syrians, their neighbors, were at war with them. And then he goes on to talk about the various enemies that they had. And then down to here it says, then it is worth inquiring who it is on whom the nations are to set their hopes. Obviously, there must be someone, for the prophet could not have told a lie. But did any of the holy prophets or of the early patriarchs die on the cross for the salvation of all? Was any of them wounded and killed for the healing of all? Did the idols of Egypt fall down before any righteous man or king that came there? Just going to go to another page. And then he says, for where the Savior is named, every demon is driven out. Again, who has ever so rid men of their natural passions, that fornicators became chaste, and murderers no longer wielded the sword, and those who formerly were craven cowards boldly played the man? In a word, what persuaded the barbarians and heathen folk in every place to drop their madness and give heed to peace, save the faith of Christ and the sign of the cross? While they were yet idolaters, the Greeks and barbarians were always at war with each other and were even cruel to their own kith and kin. Nobody could travel by land or sea at all unless he was armed with swords, because of their irreconcilable quarrels with each other. Indeed, the whole course of their life was carried on with weapons, and the sword with them replaced the staff and was the mainstay of all aid. All this time, as I said before, they were serving idols and offering sacrifices to demons, and for all the superstitious awe that accompanied this idol worship, nothing could wean them from that warlike spirit. But strange to relate, since they came over to the school of Christ as men moved with real compunction, they have laid aside their murderous cruelty and are war-minded no more. On the contrary, all is peace among them, and nothing remains save for friendship. Who then is he who has done these things and has united in peace those who hated each other, save the beloved Son of the Father, the common Savior of all, Jesus Christ, who by his own love underwent all things for our salvation, even from the beginning. Moreover, this peace that he was to administer was foretold. For the scripture says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into sickles, and nation shall not take sword against nation, neither shall they learn any more to wage war. Nor is this by any means incredible. So Saint Athanasius himself is testifying that when Jesus took over, the spirit of war ended, and all of the idolatry of paganism ceased. These are categorical truths that we can know that Jesus actually ruled and reigned on earth, because these things were not able to be brought to an end before. This to me is the most astounding evidence of all. But let's move on. So I want to step forward to the Little Season War situation that is never ceasing reality, kind of like our reality during this time. And it appears to be that this is kind of this building war. You know, they're constantly building more and more and more, I guess, war machines and tools of war, where we read that when Jesus is in charge, there's total peace. Nobody picks up a weapon. You know, it's like that. So I want to show you, I'm going to just step a little bit into a clip from a movie called Lucky Number 11. And basically this scene, it can be a little bit jarring, and I'm just going to warn you that there's a kind of unexpected sudden death in this, a little moment of violence. But I want to show you, it's called the Kansas City Shuffle. And I want to just talk a little bit about this because it's kind of the trick they play on us. So let me show you this scene here.
There was a time.
$4:35.
You misunderstood. I wasn't asking for the time. I was just saying there was a time.
There was a time?
Mm-hmm. Take brown sugar back there, for example.
She's 70.
If she's a day, there was a time.
I don't
Name's
follow.
Smith. I'm from out of town.
Listen, Mr. Smith.
Just Smith. The reason I'm in town, in case you're wondering, because of a Kansas City Shuffle.
What's a Kansas City Shuffle?
Kansas City Shuffle is when everybody looks right, you go left. It's not something people hear about. Falls on deaf ears mostly. This particular one's been over 20 years in the making. Involves a lot of people. People connected only by the slightest of events. Like whispers in the night. In that place that never forgets. Even when those people do.
I don't understand. Why did they kill Max's family?
New outfit in town. They didn't want somebody else betting on a fixed horse race with them. They're trying to make an impression.
That's a fucking story, man.
Charlie Chaplin entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest in Monte Carlo and came in third. Now that's a story. This this is something else.
So that's a Kansas City shuffle.
No. It's just the inciting incident. The catalyst. This is a Kansas City shuffle. They look right. And you go left. Sorry about that, son. Sometimes there's more to life than just living. Besides, you can't have a Kansas City shuffle without a body.
So that depicts for me a good way to show what I'm going to talk about next. And so I just kind of found that a good way to talk about the way that I think the adversary and the minions of the adversary actually show through their own admission that they destroy trust. They use unexpected or unsuspecting people, and they ruthlessly, kind of use and abuse through distraction, actually, to find and really the ends justify the means in their eyes. That's really the bottom line for them. So I find the term Kansas City Shuffle really useful because it kind of shows that deceptive snake-like approach to, you think the thing is going right, but it's actually going left, or you think it's going left and it's going right, and it's very snakish. Have you ever watched a snake move through the grass? You think it's there, and then suddenly it's over there, and that for me is, I think the snake has that legendary status of being deceptive on many levels, but generally speaking, what I'm going to talk about here is how they have everyone looking right when actually everything's happening over on the left, or they have everyone looking west when everything is actually happening in the east. And that's kind of the general direction I'm taking this. So this slide here, just going on with the peace versus war theme. So peace being the Millennial Reign, war being the loosing of Satan, the evidence of the loosing of Satan. And so following the Millennial Reign, the release of Satan can be marked by a reappearance of war. In our current age, the industry of war prevails and is even celebrated. So consider all the ceremonies, for example, that involve the war veterans and the industries associated with war, the number of people that the war industry employs alone, let alone the money behind it all. So the all-consuming war machine is fueled by concepts such as independence, freedom, liberty, and this resounding call perpetuates mass coercion through conflict, fear, and violence. Okay, war is a pagan practice. I've just put there on this slide here. War is a pagan practice. It is a ritual blood sacrifice of people in exchange for power, dominion, and wealth. And I don't say that in disrespect to people who have served in war. Now, I have family who have served in war. So, I'm not saying this with any disrespect to people who are involved. Most of the people involved don't know, I would say, the big picture of all of this, or they're not, plugged into the right information. And, most of them are providing for their families. They're, doing what they think in most cases is the right thing to do. So there is no disrespect to the individuals. I would say that the war machine itself being run by a much bigger adversary is what I'm talking about here. So, I want to just comment that on this slide, global firearms, more than 1 billion firearms in the world as of this particular screenshot, which was 2017 or 2018. And so these estimates, and most of them actually being in civilian hands. It's disturbing when we just read that the word of prophecy that said they will beat their spears into plowshares. and that kind of not picking up a weapon at all, no need to have a weapon. So I think, just from the basis, from that comparison alone, we're definitely seeing a change from the Millennial Reign. And the other factor I want to talk about today with regards to war, and this is the very, very important part, is that people are displaced as a result of war. And so, what an interesting way to start shifting narratives by shifting people around. Now, the screenshot on the left is the Pacific Ocean with the Terra de Jesu portrayed in the middle of the Pacific, or at the northern hemisphere of the Pacific Ocean. And then on the right, we have the sort of modern narrative of that area, which will tell you there was land there. Okay, so that isn't actually hidden. And they also tell you that people went across different directions on and across that land. Now, I'm not saying that's a true narrative, but what I'm going to say now is that they are admitting that people go back and forth across these areas. And I would say it's more intentional than maybe they let on. Now, this is just an example. I had some highlighting done on this document, but it all disappeared. So I'm just going to show you what I'm talking about. So even in the modern age, forced displacement, this is just an example. So forced displacement in this region because of conflict. And then what they do is they enact diplomacy, which basically starts to talk with the people about how they might return and on what terms they might return to a certain area after the conflict is kind of, let's say, in the past, these people might look at ways of returning under international jurisdiction, under an international treaty of some kind. And these are the ways in which the control is put into place. You see, if you create enough chaos, people lose control, and the powers that are waiting in the wings can step in and take control of these areas and these people. And then they become the people that are moving people around, as we see a lot. So I'm going to start talking about how places and, I would say historical narratives are shifted in these ways. Because when you start moving people around and you start claiming certain areas under treaty that belong to these people, you start actually creating new places with the same names and the same historical narratives associated with them. This is a really tricky thing to explain, so I'm going to really try to make it sound like it makes sense, because it does, and it is actually how they do it. Now, the first thing I want to focus on is the Millennial Reign common narrative of Byzantium. So I believe that Byzantium is code for the land of Jesus, or the kingdom of Jesus. And we know that Constantinople and Constantine are affiliated with the Byzantium kingdom. And in and throughout history, this is, considered to be the kingdom, the Christian kingdom, right? So, and by all accounts, the Christian kingdom reigned for 1,000 years, and you will see this throughout history. So, I mean, it kind of even documents it here, but more explicitly in some places. And the other thing I want to just mention, if you haven't heard me say this before, the Greeks were the people who are attributed with charting and mapping the whole of the Arctic North. And what I have shown throughout my studies in my sides of the North in particular is that the Greeks are way more affiliated with the North. And I do believe that they are actually Northerners. They are not from the Mediterranean originally. And so this is one of the confusing narratives. People are drawn to what is placed before them in school and education and all of these kind of sources. But actually, if you just dig a little bit below the surface, you'll start to see that when you logically add up the narratives, they don't make a lot of sense. And there's a lot of this going on. So I'm going to start talking about this. But Byzantium is one of the things we have to talk about, because Byzantium is one of these things that they shifted over to the west, over to, I would say, what they call Eurasia or Asia Minor. And in my mind, Byzantium was the kingdom of Jesus Christ. After he returned, he set up his kingdom on earth, and it was worldwide. Um, I could say a lot of things that will just trigger people right now, but like, for example, I think the Byzantium kingdom is what they attribute to the Roman Empire. Now, in the scriptures, we actually read about Rome, which I think was a governing body, and Jan has done work on this as well on the puzzle picture, but she and I kind of talk about this quite a lot, but I think that Byzantium, the kingdom of Jesus, was the worldwide empire that we see in all of the cities, all of the countries, everywhere. There's evidence of it all over the world. And it only makes sense when Jesus was the reigning king of all the earth for 1,000 years. Rome, on the other hand, gets all the credit. And that's just one of the things I want to start challenging a little bit, is that, I think it's fair enough to say that during the time of the old temple system and Rome being the governing, sort of, let's say, the government that was ruling over, kind of the people on the earth, or in that region, or in their jurisdiction, it's called the world. It's not called the earth, it's called the world. And so the world and the earth are two different things. And I think that the world was the people that they were governing over. So anyway, without getting too much into that, I think Rome is often conflated with what was actually the empire of Jesus Christ. And Byzantium is the name that they give to this Christian empire. And they kind of just make it like almost a mythical existence of these people, and they don't really explore it too much. But then there's allegedly all these other things going on at the same time. So history is very convoluted on purpose so that we don't understand actually what went on, because if we knew that Jesus returned, we would actually, it makes a lot more sense, right? So what I'm trying to show here is that Byzantium was colonized by Greeks. And this makes more sense where we know the land of Jesus to be, when we know that the Greeks were actually northern cartographers. Okay. It doesn't make sense for the Greeks to have come out of the Mediterranean, gone all the way up to the extreme north, gone all around the north, and gone all the way back down into the Mediterranean. It makes more sense that they actually lived in the north, and they knew the north, and they, mapped the north. That's my understanding, and you're free to disagree, but I'm just, I'm explaining what I've come across in my own studies. And then it says here that later, because they have to shift the narrative, Byzantium became referred to as the Eastern Roman Empire. Now let's replace Byzantine Empire instead of Rome, and let's just replace Byzantine with the land of Jesus. So what I'm trying to do here is get us to think about things in more of a realistic perspective, not being guided by the narrative that these people want us to believe. So the origins of Byzantium are shrouded in legend. As you can see here, they talk about it in this kind of very mystical language, as if it's all disappeared. There's really nothing left to see. And I have some, beliefs about this. Something about Byzantium is that it's across the Bosphorus on the Asiatic side. So there's always this relationship to Asia. When any time you get into a little bit more of the weeds with Byzantium, it's always to do with Asia. Well, of course, they had to create Asia Minor to account for the historical relationship that Byzantium has with Asia. And you'll even see here that the city was taken over by Persian Empire, and then there's the Scythian campaign, and all of these are actually North and very Eastern Asian references. These people lived in Eastern Asia, and I, again, just go back and watch my videos, but I bring all the receipts for that. So I just want us to start here with Byzantium or Byzantine Empire. And then I want to just show you here how easy it is to conflate things using maps. Now the Byzantium or Constantinople was on a peninsula, and these days they'll tell you that was in modern day Turkey. But again, I reject the Asia Minor model, and I believe that there was a superimposing of what was actually going on in the east, which is where Byzantium was. And I think there's a superimposing, taking that and placing it over a different region. So, it's like taking a wax paper picture and just putting it over another picture, and then you can just kind of overlay things, right? So this is what I believe is going on. Now, if you just were to turn that map a little bit, you could pretty much end up with a strait, just like the Terra di Esso has there next to Asia. And so I'm questioning whether Byzantium and the Terra di Esso are the same thing, and they've just superimposed it over to Asia. So something that everyone who has done any sort of in-depth research or even light research into the history of Christianity, you will come across this phrase, which is the Great Schism or the East-West Schism. And I bring this up because it's, according to the title of my video, East is East. Yet what they've done is they've created in our minds a schism. They've created this version of what was in the East, but they've moved it west. So they've moved it, so the papal seat, what they call the papal seat, I don't believe there were any popes in the kingdom of Jesus, but they moved this so-called, what they call the papal seat, to where they call Rome, and they created the Holy Roman Empire, and they created this schism saying, well, we know that all of the history actually is Eastern Christianity, but we're going to assume that this theological dispute took place, and now we're going to create this confusing scenario. And at the same time, they just moved everything to the west. So they took everything away from the east, which is near the land of Jesus, which is where I believe Byzantine was, or, the word Byzantine, which was actually the land of Jesus, and they've moved it all into the Mediterranean Asia Minor region. So they've tried to retain some of that Asia flavor in the narrative, but they've also split into two because, they had to kind of part ways with the East and create this whole Western version of Christianity. And as we know, most of us will agree that is a false Christianity. So the East-West Schism is also known as the Great Schism, and this narrative will say it was from 1054. Let's set aside dates. I don't really want to get caught up in dates because it's too difficult to try and prove, and I think those are kind of fruitless conversations for certain things. I think the important part with this is that we need to recognize what they were actually doing here. So what the narrative really pushes is it pushes a wedge of lies into things. Into the understanding of Christianity, for one thing. So they introduced popes. They reintroduced Rome, right? So this kind of governance of Rome. And so the agenda is always leading with lies. And they say the most effective lies actually contain a certain amount of truth. And so there is a very sinister psychology to that method of deception, but that's what I truly believe is going on here. And so these schisms actually are more introducing a schism into Christianity than what they might be doing. So they're saying like the church split on theological narratives, but I think what they're actually doing is they're creating a false narrative that creates a schism in our minds. Recently, I was told by several viewers that I should watch the Mission Impossible newest movie. I haven't watched it yet, but I did watch the 2023 because actually I looked up online and that was a precursor to the one that's come out in 2025. So I found that one online and I've recorded some of it because the whole theme is actually related. So I'm going to play a clip here and then we'll talk about it after, but I want to really draw out some of these very interesting clues that we see in this video.
Sevastopol. Operation Podkova. Day 74. The active learning defense system we are testing continues to operate flawlessly. One might even say miraculously. We are navigating under the Arctic ice cap. The Sevastopol has deliberately approached every navy in the world and remained completely undetected. The Podkova's stealth capability has exceeded all expectations. We are at this moment the state of the art of war. The most fearsome killing machine ever devised by man. And we are impossible to find. There's a bug in the system. A ghost in a machine.
Torpedo range 200 meters!
So that video was really interesting. I was heavily edited because I had to be able to play it without having a copyright strike on my channel. But yeah, so the main key points I want to draw out of that were that the name Sevastopol and the cruciform key are two of the things. There's also the weapon itself that's called the entity, which is a big part of that. So that's basically the enemy in the Mission Impossible movie. And then the submarine itself being named Sevastopol and hovering under the Arctic ice in the Bering Sea. And I suppose that these clues that are seeded throughout the movie are pointing at something. And so I want to just explain a little bit more. Now, Crimea is a place that a lot of people probably aren't even familiar with. But I remember when in, I guess it was 2023, the Ukraine situation in the news started to become more of a story. And so you start to hear this sort of Ukraine narrative, and you also start to hear, in conjunction with that, a Crimea, this place called Crimea, which, if you don't live in that region, you don't live anywhere near these places, you don't really know anything about them, and I didn't. So really, a couple of years ago, I was going back and I was looking over the maps, and I was like, this is interesting. But as I started researching the west coast of North America in my Coastal Cataclysm series, it was a very strange thing that happened, that Crimea started to crop up on the west coast of North America. And so I became familiar with a little bit more of the historical references of Crimea and I guess the Ukraine in general. A little bit of a background. My family, my mom's side are Ukrainian and, Canadian Ukrainians. And it had started to occur to me that they were quite poor when they migrated here. It was in the early 20th century, so we're talking early 1900s, I guess. And they kind of just had a horse and a cart, and they were sent to a piece of land, and they started farming it. Now, when you imagine people in the early 20th century coming from Europe, you often just think of them coming because they came on a boat, allegedly, and you think of them coming on boats from across the Atlantic. But it started to occur to me as I was studying the Pacific and as I was studying a little bit more of the Western Canada region in relation to these, Millennial Reign studies and the Little Season, I started to have questions about, did they come over the Pacific Ocean? Was that the way they came, and then they would have landed on the West Coast and they would have gone over into the prairies? So that was such a strange idea to me because I'd never thought about that before. But as I talk now, this will make more sense to you because this is going to really make you scratch your head, because it did for me. But I had a contact from Japan reach out to me through Instagram and actually confirm some of what I'm going to tell you right now. So I thank the user, and I'll get to that information, the follower on Instagram, for sending me this information. But what it did was it actually drew a line, like, when you do connect the dots and you start to see a picture. So I started seeing all these dots connecting, and I started to see Crimea being so loud in the press during this Ukraine scenario that was unfolding from 2023 was actually a continuation of a long history. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. And I'm going to be putting 3 major locations in your frame right now. We're going to talk about Crimea, we're going to talk about Korea, and we're going to talk about the Ukraine. And so one of the locations that I'm going to start with actually is Crimea. So will the real Crimea please stand up? And I want you to approach this idea with faith, not by sight. So let me take you to, first of all, I'm going to show you what the news actually says about Crimea. So if you type Crimea and you go to a news menu item there, you'll see there is a lot that has to be said about Crimea. And always in conjunction with the Ukraine, because it's kind of this situation where the Ukraine and Crimea are, let's say, very close. The other thing you will see about Crimea is it often wraps in this narrative about the Tartars. Okay, so let's just put that in the back of our mind a little bit, that this is a very hot news focus, this place called Crimea. And now I'm going to go to a map and I'm going to show you. Let's go first to Crimea on modern day map. And as I said before, what you'll notice is that this so-called Asia Minor becomes the focus of this narrative. Okay, so I'm going to try and unravel it a little bit just to see what falls out. So we have Sevastopol, which was actually the name of that submarine that we saw in the video just now. Okay, so Sevastopol, Crimea. And what's the history of Sevastopol? Well, would you believe it's related to the Romanovs? It was invaded by Russia. Okay, so I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe this is the original Sevastopol, and I do not believe this is the historical Crimea location. And I'll tell you why. As I was, well, let's first just look at the news stories would tell you that there's a lot of war-related effort going on in Crimea. Okay, so it's just like, it's like this, it's given almost this very warlike persona. Yet when I did research, I actually went down on the, not down on the ground, but like on street cams and things like that, and I just wandered around and I was like, actually, it's very much a farming, very quiet, very low population kind of place. And I did not actually see too much in the way of war stations or anything like that. You can see there's a lot of farmland in this region here. But yet they do draw this kind of narrative as if it's a very war-torn area. And so I find it hard to believe that this little peninsula here is actually very war-torn at all. And it sits right below what we would call the Ukraine and Poland. So these two areas right above, and then there's this kind of peninsula. And the other thing about that region is that it is very close to the Middle East and Turkey in particular. So Turkey within, I guess, that kind of distance to this particular peninsula. The very, very odd thing that I found as I was looking at the West Coast, the history particularly of Vancouver Island and the west coast of Canada, is that there was a hospital in the Victoria region of Vancouver Island that serviced as a war hospital for the Crimea. Well, tell me how a place that is this far away from the so-called location could possibly be a war hospital. Well, I'll show you right here. So this place here, hospital buildings. And you'll see here, it says, these buildings were constructed at the request of this Admiral Bruce, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, in order to provide temporary hospital facilities for the naval sick and wounded of the Crimean War. How does that make any sense at all? And there are pictures. This makes no logical sense. How can Crimea, in the Black Sea, in the middle of so-called Eurasia or Asia Minor, be serviced by a hospital way over here? I would submit that is impossible. Okay. However, let's look at what is close to this so-called Crimean War Hospital. Oh, look, this area is somewhat close, probably not as close as it looks there. But then again, we are looking at a fake sphere model here. So apologies for the sphere, but this is what we have to work with when we're looking at locations. So yeah, my suspicion was piqued because I thought, how on earth can that possibly be true? And yet it's right there in the official military museum writing. Okay. I find it impossible, and therefore it can't be true. One of these pieces of this narrative cannot be true. Okay. So what I'm getting to here is that the schism actually started to produce this shift of locations, And, you know, they haven't been careful enough to cover up some of the narrative. So let's go look at Crimea itself. And what I would like to do is just highlight that they keep referring to Crimea as kind of belonging to this area historically, which is kind of more related to the Tartars and the Khanate, so the Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde, and there's a lot of that history wrapped up in the story of Crimea, or the history of Crimea. And then they talk about the spelling of the name, so La Crimea. And, you know, it's sort of a little bit more recent in terms of its spelling as well. So the name of it actually has kind of evolved over time, which I'm going to get into a little bit more. But they still refer to it as Tartar, and I'm going to challenge that now as I start to show a little more evidence. So one of the things I want to just draw your attention to is the flamenco hypothesis. This is not my theory, but I'm just bringing it to your attention, that Jesus was born somewhere in modern-day Crimea and died on Joshua's Hill in Constantinople in 12th century. Now, double check that. I've heard his theory said something else. So, but just generally speaking, there are these theories out here that Crimea actually had something to do with Jesus directly. And so that is just something that I want to start bringing closer to the land of Jesus and away from this false narrative of the Mediterranean, Asia, Eurasia region. Now, something else I want to point out is that when we're talking about Crimea and Sevastopol in particular, that city is historically documented as being taken by the Russians, and specifically as a strategic location. Now, when we know what we know, and we know that Gog and Magog, let's just bring it back into the little season, Gog and Magog are these two biblical rebel factions that are coming against the camp of the saints in the beloved city at the end of the little season. And it is my view that Gog is the prince of Rosh, as described in Ezekiel, but the nations of Gog and Magog are described actually by John Prester in one of his letters to Constantinople, that describe the nations of Gog and Magog as being something like 12 or 15 nations, and they were basically the people that did not, in my view, submit, and from what I've seen, they did not submit to the rule of Jesus, and therefore they were banished. And these are the ones that will be deceived and will come against the camp of the saints in the beloved city. Now, if you look here, so let's just say the two heads of this imperial double-headed eagle are representative of Gog and Magog. So we have, in my mind, the East and the West. We have, let's say, Russia and the United States. They keep tabs from both sides of the Pacific Ocean, from Alaska and from Asia, on the Bering Sea region, or on that expanse of area that I believe to be the land of Jesus, and, you know, probably veiled at this point. And I've seen a lot to suggest that it is veiled to keep the tribes at peace. Now, something that I'm just pointing out here is that the Russians came to the coasts facing Byzantium. So Sevastopol in particular was facing the coast of Byzantium. Now, if you look at the new maps, they've put Crimea and Sevastopol over in the Black Sea facing Turkey, because then they can say, well, that Turkey was Constantinople, that was the seat of Byzantium, so therefore Crimea is in the Black Sea. You see what they do? So they kind of just transposed it there. The other thing I would like to point out is, from that clip, but also from the movies, the Mission Impossible movies, they use this cruciform key for the Sevastopol. Okay, so the Sevastopol being this elusive, dangerous submarine carrying the most destructive weapon known to man ever. And, you know, in their mind, they are the enemies of Jesus. They are the enemies of God. And therefore, God is their enemy. He's the most destructive force. They consider it like that because they are occultist Gnostics, and they believe that God is their enemy and that they have to destroy him. So this is why these movies exist. So this key, I could reflect back on the keys that Jesus gave to the disciples, to Peter, the keys of the kingdom, and being in that region where the land of Jesus is, and also being kind of part of this story of the Sevastopol and Crimea. And all of these pieces start to, as I say, you pick pieces out and you start to put them together. And it definitely starts to fit into a storyline and start forming a picture. So one of the other things I want to start talking about is Korea. And I guess first of all, I just want to go to this map. So most of the maps that they've transposed, they kind of lay over in a very similar way, because you can, if you just turn the map and you place people and events in certain places, you can just recreate the same scenarios. So this map is something I came across, which was pretty interesting, and it kind of wants to detail a lot of these areas that we're talking about now. However, I wanted to point out that there was a little bit of a discrepancy that suggests that it isn't actually accurate. And it talks about Oriental cities and all of that, but actually it's in the Mediterranean and the Eurasia. So it says here, some of the islands in front of Quinsay would represent the Chasen Archipelago, and further south, the large island of Hainan. Sir Henry Yule points out that Kaoli is the name of Korea, from which he deduces that this would be a confused notion of the Korean peninsula. Okay, so I just want to put that in your mind as something that I think in their efforts to move things around, they were actually making errors along the way. One of them being the one I showed before, which was that Crimean War Hospital being nowhere near modern day Crimea. And this one, so this is another discrepancy in the narrative. And Korea is one of the places that I want to talk about. So I'm going to go and just sort of talk a little bit about the very similar narrative that Crimea and Korea actually have. So basically, Crimea and Korea were both taken, annexed, and taken over by Soviet Russia, okay, as was the Ukraine. So all of these related narratives are playing out in a very similar way using this overlaid geography, okay? And it is my view that it's possible that they are conflating Crimea and Korea. And so this becomes a little bit more understandable and coherent when you start to realize that there's an overlay of actual events, and the wars that took place actually took kind of place by the same aggressor, and these places actually were taken over. So now I want to highlight something that I thought about that came to me in scripture. So in Numbers 16, and this is going to speak to the rebellion part of the little season and where I think it fits into this regional geographical area that I'm really realizing on the east of Asia, we have this problematic area that was taken over, that was annexed by Russia, and they've created decoys, moving names of places over into the Eurasia region and the Mediterranean region to distract us from where they actually happened. And I believe that Korea and Japan and the islands in that area, including Kamchatka, are what we would actually, in a real narrative, refer to as the Ukraine and the land of Jesus in that region. So I want to draw attention to the spelling of something here. And it just came to me because what I see in the little season is this rise of the rebels, the rebel class, the enemies of God, the ultimate rebels, Gog and Magog. And it seems very interesting to me that much of the problematic war, the warlike season in which we live, rose out of the East Asia region. And it made me think, as I was looking at the name Korea and Crimea, that there's a very similar name in scripture. Now I'm using the Douay Rheims 1899 American edition translation for this because you can see that the way that Kor is spelt instead of Korah in the rebellion of Korah is something I just wanted to highlight here. And also in the book of Jude, verse 11. So I'm first going to read a passage from Numbers. So this is from number 16, and I would say it's the Kor rebellion. And I am relating it to Korea because it is spelt with a C and a K in different translations. And this is where this rebel tribe or family had come out of Egypt with Israel, and they were of the Levi tribe actually, and they were rebelling against Moses. And even though Moses had asked God not to harm them, God actually used Kor or Korah as an example of what his um, response to rebellion was. And so they were rebelling, and this came to a head actually in number 16. So he said to the multitude, "Depart from the tents of these wicked men and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be involved in their sins. But if the Lord do a new thing, and the earth opening her mouth swallow them down, and all things that belong to them, and they go down alive into hell, you shall know that they have blasphemed the Lord." And immediately, as he had made an end of speaking, the earth broke asunder under their feet, and opening her mouth devoured them with their tents and all their substance. And this event is actually recorded in Jude as well as part of the warning to the church. And it says here, "Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and after the error of Balaam, they have their reward poured out themselves, and have perished in the contradiction of Kor." So I want to show you the very similar spelling actually that Crimea and Korea originally had, or at least in the French. On the maps and in historical texts, Crimea is spelled Crimee with a little hyphen over the E, and Korea is actually spelled Coree with a little hyphen over the E. Now, the geography and history in these Soviet annexed countries' rule is practically equivalent. So not to mention the names of these places. So I'm just going to zoom in on these and show you how similar the features are. So you've got a peninsula sticking off of the mainland there, and you've got Coree, Coree, and you can see the west coast here, and you can see actually how close it is to Yeso in Japan there. And so if we're talking of the closeness of, let's say, Sevastopol, what they wanted us to believe was over in the Black Sea, let's say it's actually over on the east coast of Asia, and it can actually see the coast of the land of Jesus, or Byzantium by modern language. And here's just some more examples of this location and its proximity to the land of Jesus. And one other thing I've explored as well is that the Wall of China could have served as a highway, as referenced in scripture in the prophecies, a highway to the city. And so we see how it ends right there. It actually ends, according to what I've seen, it ends in North Korea. And as we know, North Korea is very guarded. And right here you can see Korea, okay? And how close that is to the land of Jesus. And we also have here Korea, and it's very close to this area here. And again, it's a peninsula, you see. So that and it's always depicted a little differently, so it does make you wonder exactly what it does look like. But that is that's the lay of the land, literally. And it can, you can see, well, on this map at least, you can see the land of Jesus from there. And that was what was described as the Crimean Sevastopol. You could see the land of Jesus from its coastline. And the other thing they do is they often talk about Tartars in Crimea. They talk about the Crimean Tartars, and they also talk about kind of this relationship with Tartaria and all of those, Scythians and the Goths and all of those. Well, it makes a lot more sense that they live right near actual Tartary in this region here. As you can see, it's very close. It's actually directly below, or yeah, below this Tartar region here. So I tend to believe that there is a closer correlation to Korea than Crimea in the modern term. So this is the person that contacted me on Instagram, and I thank you very much. The person's name is Yesu, which is very close to Yesu, Jesus, the name of Jesus. And they wrote that in ancient Japan, they're talking about these northern territories. So you can see the names of them here: Shakotan, Habomai, Kanashiri, and Etarofu. So these islands here are considered to be the northern territories. So in ancient Japan, Hokkaido, the northern territories, and Sakhalin were collectively referred to as Ezo. Also in ancient Japan, the Lord Jesus was called Yaso. Okay, so there is actual lore that comes from Japan as well to say that Jesus died in Japan. And that is kind of a legend that comes along with Japan. So another piece of evidence that lets me believe that Crimea was actually in Asia is that they weave a narrative that, again, doesn't really make a lot of sense. And it has to do with the Black Death and Crimea. So the disease originated in Central Asia and was taken to the Crimea by Mongol warriors and traders. So, they shift all of this over as if it's in the Mediterranean area, but let's see. So the Black Death had started in China, where people occasionally contract the disease to this day, although the record of the pandemic in Asia is not so well documented, as does state in the history of Ming that the first wave of the plague hit China in 1344, 3 years prior to its outbreak in Europe. So something that, just continually comes up in this Crimea narrative is that it's actually more correlated with the Mongols, the Tartars, the Scythians, which are all in East Asia. And therefore, I continue to contend that Crimea is actually on the East Asian coast. Now, whether that's Korea, whether it's Kamchatka, or one of the islands, I tend to think it fits the peninsula narrative really well. And therefore, I would say that the Crimea and the Korea correlation is probably what we're looking at in terms of historical alignment and evidence. Just to go back, I've shown this slide before, but for any who haven't seen it, so I think it's very possible that the Great Wall of China was a highway for pilgrims to travel to the Celestial City from all over Europe and Asia. And Isaiah 49:11-12 says, "And I will make all my mountains a way, and my highways shall be exalted. Behold, these shall come from afar, and lo, these from the north, and from the west, and from the land of Sinim." Isaiah 35:8, "And an highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools shall not err therein." And as we've seen previously in the 1818 Noah Webster's Dictionary, the Celestial Empire is often used in Europe and America as a popular designation of China. It is derived, according to Williams, from the Chinese word Tianchan, that is, heavenly dynasty, meaning the kingdom ruled over by the dynasty appointed by heaven. And one thing about Sevastopol, which is again a reference to that elusive submarine that needed a cruciform key to actually activate this weapon aboard that is floating beneath the Bering Sea. All of these narratives actually kind of are clues. And so basically, this just tells us that Sevastopol was a city in the Ukraine located on the peninsula of Crimea. And so what I'm seeing now is that the Ukraine And my story about my family migrating to Western Canada, I think there's a very strong case that what we know of as the Ukraine of today is not the, let's say, the historical land of Ukraine. So, and they're annexed by the Soviet Russia back in the day, and they are still considered to have being ruled over by Russia, and that's where a lot of these war narratives come from. So I want to go to this document here that actually talks about the Kamchatka Peninsula, because this is where Petropavlovsk, we've talked about that place before, where it's actually named after Peter and Paul, and there were ships that were actually coming out of there that were attributed to Peter and Paul, Saint Peter and Saint Paul, and those are on the peninsula of Kamchatka. So here we can see that as early as 1565, it began to be said that north of the main island of the group lay, so these are talking about the Japanese islands, so an island called Yezo. Today we identify this island without hesitation as the important Japanese island of Yezo. But for a long time, its position and nature were the standing enigma of the geographers, who gave the name indiscriminately to an island to the peninsula of Kamchatka, to the mainland north of Kamchatka, and as we shall see, to the east coast running, which existed only in the confusion of their thoughts. They do like to throw this around. So calling one Yeso-Gasima, that is the island Yeso, and other Oko Yeso and Upper Yeso. And then further down, in the meantime, for nearly 2 centuries, the cartographers exercised their choice of delineating Yezo, now in one and now in another of the several positions and categories we have just enumerated. And I'm going to go to 125. So this person, De Vries, was unable to report upon islands which had no existence. So here, this is just weaving confusion, because you have one geographer, someone who's drawing a map, who says, oh yes, there's this huge place called the land of Yeso. And then right away, another person who's being paid by their government will come along and make them sound like a terrible, map maker, because they're, claiming this place to exist, but they're actually being commissioned to say it doesn't exist. And so there was the war of the maps, okay? So here we have Dudley carries the island from the Korean coast to points 1/3 or 1/4 of the way across the Pacific. North of Japan is displayed one of the longest of the world's coastlines, an unbroken reach of shore running east from the northern tip of island of Korea, virtually all the way across the Pacific. And this cartographer was called Dudley. In one of his maps, the Carta Terza General d'Asia, the eastern extremity of Yezo is separate from California by the Strait of Yezo, the Stretto di Yezo, of some 300 leagues in width. In another of them, the Carta, this other map, the strait, being at some 5 degrees north of Cape Mendocino on the California coast, has been narrowed to about 600 miles. Dudley's Yezo displays many legends of a geographical nature upon its coastline, and conveniently situated about half of its length, a port called Matsumai, probably a confusion arising from the existence of such a port on a small island between Hondu and the true Yezo of the Japanese group. And here in pink, this map, shows the influence of the Vries voyage, and further an ill-defined but extensive landmass in the northern Pacific, bearing a legend which permits the observer a wide choice in the naming of it, that is Terra de Yeso, Oyeso, Yedo, Yeso, all of these names. In the same cartographer's second sheet, found also his Atlantic Vento. This land is further designated Terra della Campagna. So there's naming conventions going on here. There's one group naming it this, and this guy's saying it's the land of Yeso. It's a huge island separated from Staten Island by, and yeah, we'll get to that, Staten Island, from California by the Strait of Anian. So here, obviously, Yeso has been identified in the cartographer's mind with this, what the Dutch named Campagneland of Martens Vries. So in this map, the Terra de Campania shows 45 degrees in the eastern hemisphere, becomes in the western Gamaland, and stretches across the Pacific to the Strait of Anian. Just to make confusion more confounded, this vast stretch bears the legend Terra Incognus o Terra di Esso. Still further to complicate matters, the Asiatic mainland north of Kamchatka is named Terra di Esso. I'm just going to keep reading a little bit further here. In the curious Turkish book, now I believe Turkey was also, or the Turkics, were also in Northeast Asia. And the world map reveals Gamaland and then running from a point northeast of Japan. So I'm just drawing your attention to this very important investigation into the true existence of the land of Jesus as we move into why would they distract us? Why would they push us towards the west for our distraction, like for us to go and look at? Now, I want to give you some insight into a little more information that this lovely person from Japan told me. So I'm going to try and put something on the screen here. So these are Japanese, but I'm going to translate them. And this is actually a blog. And so the Japanese are picking up on this millennial reign of Christ. So this is not just purely American or Canadian or British or wherever, or Australian. People in Japan are starting to talk about this. And this is actually a blog that's been put together. And even, so lots of scripture there. And even my friend Ricardo's video has been embedded into there. If you haven't seen it, go to Contend for the Faith on YouTube and find this Jesus Already Returned video about the Satan's Little Season in 5 minutes. And that's a really good one. I like to send people to that channel because Ricardo does a good job of explaining things like that. And I want to, this person, Yasu, told me on Instagram was this, that their father told them that Ukrainians and Polish were living in the 4 territories north of Japan. Now, when we know that the north of Japan is actually within reach of the land of Jesus, the Terra di Esso, it does make you wonder what is actually going on in that region and why does it relate to the Ukraine? And it answers for me as well how there could be Ukrainians living on that side of Russia, Asia, who came over and migrated to Western Canada in the early 20th century. And I just want to draw a little bit of a correlation here. So Sakhalin Oblast is actually in East Asia, okay? And yet we have this headline. It says, serious distortions created by the invasion of Ukraine drone flight ban in Sakhalin Oblast. Now that is in Japan. And this is from 2023. So during the Ukraine conflict, these northern territories of Japan were the hive of activity. Now, when that Ukraine event kicked off on the news, I went straight away to street cams to look at the Ukraine, like Kiev and places like that. I did not see any conflict. Now, I'm not saying there weren't places that weren't in conflict. I don't know, I wasn't there. But what I'm saying is my suspicion is starting to grow that when you start looking at World War II and World War I, much of the conflict was in the region of Japan. Much of the enemy fighting was actually in the region of East Asia, including Manchuria, which is in China, and a lot of places like that. So what I'm getting at here is that there is a Ukrainian, so 40% of the northern territories, this is in Japan, are Ukrainians. Okay, so there's a whole diplomatic thing going on in the northern territories of Japan. And it's talking about negotiations for the return of the country whatever due to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And it conflates the Ukrainian people in Japan. So here we go, 40,000 of the inhabitants of the Northern Territories, so 1.7 million people, are Ukrainian. The Hokkaido Shimbun wrote an article stating that 1 in 3 islanders is from Ukraine. So it must have been known to people who knew about it for a long time. Why does Japan support Ukraine when illegal occupation by people from Ukraine continues in the Northern Territories? Some commentators argued that President Zelensky's speech on March 23rd should call on Ukrainians to leave the islands and return them to Japan. So this is a forced occupation. And when we're talking about the land of Jesus and we're talking about the distance, the closeness that those islands actually have to the land of Jesus, and then we start wondering why this war in Ukraine. What is the point of it all? Well, I'm just wondering if there's more correlation to this land of Jesus story, and if this explains it a little bit more. And here you can see the truth of the Northern Territories. Japan people do not know the mastermind of the occupation, the contradiction of the return negotiations. And they're called the Kuril Islands. So, you know, they're actually occupied by Russia and the Ukraine. And if you go down here a little bit more, the Northern Territories issue is a topic of discussion every time Prime Minister Abe and President Putin hold a Japan-Russian summit meeting. But on March 15th, Russia's newspaper reported that President Putin had said that the speed of negotiations was slowed down significantly. And what kind of existence does the boomerang-like Northern Territories that move away when you think you are approaching Japan? I would like to first explain the basics of this theme, which I've been involved in since I was a young reporter, which is the geography and history. And they go on to talk about this lighthouse, and basically there's this, here you go. So if you look offshore, you can see a mysterious crystal island on the horizon that is flat and has no trees. You can see the old lighthouse from the Japan period on Shell Island. On the right is Uri Island. Both are of the Hobami archipelago, which is under the effective control of Russia. Why is Russia so much in control there? So we have these very interesting revelations. Thank you to my viewer from Japan for sending these. And this is the lighthouse. So Northern Territories and Shell Island occupied by Russia. And so you see why I have this very interest, I should say, in that region, knowing that what we've seen on the maps of the land of Jesus, knowing what we've seen in documents, you know, going back to some of these documents that we went through, we can see that there's actually a relationship between the land of Jesus, Japan, and all of these other sort of narratives like Crimea, Korea. And I would include even like the passage from Numbers and Jude talking about the rebellion of Kor, because the loosing of Satan has so much to do with rebellion that I just wonder if the name Kor, the name Korea, and all of these people had somehow emerged at that time from a region in that area and went to war immediately with the land of Jesus and the camp of the saints, but they had to go about it in kind of deceiving all of the nations to get involved. And as I understand it, that's kind of where things emerged from at the end of the Millennial Reign. I believe that Constantinople was the original location of the government of the land of Jesus and the kingdom of Jesus, which was worldwide. And I do believe it is now veiled. If we're allowed to go there, the Lord will show us. I don't personally know that right now, but obviously we are told to seek first the kingdom of God. and his righteousness. We are also told in Revelation 22 to come, if you thirst, and come and drink from the water of life. You know, those who've had their robes washed, those who've kept the commands, come to the gates and enter and eat of the tree of life. And, you know, so I think that, you know, this has been hidden from us for a reason. And there are people who are working for our adversary who actually want it for themselves. And there's actually a verse, I'm trying to think where it is now. I just found it on my phone. So it's Matthew 23:13. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor suffer ye them that are entering to go in. And doesn't that just seem like what is actually happening with this hiding of what I believe to be the promised land, land of Jesus, and Zion, and the holy city, and so the beloved city. And I just want to encourage you that even though we live in a time of building warfare, there's almost not a day where we don't hear about warfare. I don't personally watch the news, but I know that this theme, you know, you just hear it in passing almost every day, even if you don't watch the news, and I'm kind of aware of all these things that are allegedly going on. And I just want to encourage you to really think about this Kansas City shuffle, how it's got us to think about things in a certain way that benefit the people that are shutting up the kingdom of heaven to those of us who would seek to enter, who would be, you know, the children of God and belong to the family of Jesus. So I'm just curious, you know, about how they're going to proceed as this information comes out to the masses. And you know, I think we're all in this together. We are all walking towards we're all walking the narrow way if we're walking with Jesus, and we're seeking to please him and obey him and keep his commands. So I encourage you to stay strong in the Lord, and just remember, Jesus said, "These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." John 16:33. I'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. you.